Responding to an appeal by Pope Pius XI, Jesuit priest Walter Chiswick of Shenandoah, Pennsylvania in 1940 arrived in Russia. At the time, religious rights were suppressed and religious believers were openly persecuted, while few believers had access to a priest. So in short, what happened was that he was arrested by the NKVD in 1941 with the false accusation of being a Vatican spy, and he was sentenced to 5 years in solitary confinement in Lubyanka, where they tortured him. He was starved, he was isolated, sleep-deprived, and regularly threatened with death. The climactic moment in this process, however, came with the heat of interrogations. So they would put him through sessions that lasted for days at a time for a while. And then they would switch and they would become all-night sessions so that he wouldn't have any sleep. Sometimes they would be friendly, but then other times they would be hostile. They would approach him very charmingly, but then otherwise they would be very threatening. And they just have this schizophrenic approach because they're trying to break him down. They want him to admit that he is in fact a Vatican spy. This goes on for several months, if you can imagine. And after several months, they begin to break through. At first, he becomes resentful in his heart towards them. So they're already gaining a little territory. Then he became indifferent to their accusations. He stopped justifying himself. He was now at this point giving up. After 12 grueling months of all-day sessions, he just couldn't take it anymore, and he finally begged the Holy Spirit to help him. Because after all, as he recalls, Jesus said in the gospel, when they bring you to trial and deliver you up, do not be anxious beforehand about what you are to say. Say whatever is given you, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit given to you. But nothing came. And so he writes, feeling abandoned by God, I knew I must do something. I badly wanted to show him, he means his interrogator, who he was dealing with, not a weakling or an intimidated priest afraid to stand up for his rights, or an ignoramus who didn't know what was going on. The words, I won't sign, however, never came. I was afraid, and I was angry at myself for being afraid. And then they handed him the document admitting that he was a Vatican spy, and he signed it. So he was sent off for 15 years of hard labor in a gulag. All right, so here's the question. Why had God failed Father Walter at his hour of need? Why does he fail each of us? You feel it at times when you're overwhelmed and there aren't enough hours in the day. When you're doing everything right, but nothing's working out. When no matter how hard you try, nothing improves. Why is God failing you? The answer is God doesn't fail us. He lets us fail ourselves because sometimes that's what we need. Look at the gospel for a moment. It's so easy to praise the tax collector in this story because of his humility. But the truth is, between the Pharisee and the tax collector, they're both actually the same. They both suffer from the same spiritual illness, which is self-reliance. The difference in the parable is only the tax collector actually acknowledges that. See, like the Pharisee, the tax collector thought he could provide everything that he needed in life by himself. That's why, as a tax collector, he ignored God's law. He preferred dishonest means to gain wealth, but in the end, doing so actually broke his spirit. And the Pharisee is basically doing the same thing. He's self-sufficient when it comes to holiness. He doesn't need God. He doesn't even need God for prayer. It says that he prayed to himself. God's not even on the conversation. And Walter Chiswick is actually, despite all his virtues, no different. After expressing intense anger at God's abandonment, he says this: I realized finally that I had asked for God's help, but had really believed in my own ability to avoid evil and to meet every challenge. I had spent much time in prayer over the years. I had come to appreciate and thank God for his providence and care of me and of all men. But I had never really abandoned myself to it. And then, borrowing the language of the Pharisee, he says, I had been thanking God all the while that I was not like the rest of men, that he had given me a good physique, steady nerves, and a strong will. So had God helped him conquer the interrogator, Walter would have never learned this critical truth about his own spiritual condition. God doesn't need his help. And also that self-reliance was killing him. And so finally, he concludes this moment in his life by saying, the stronger the ingredient of self develops in our lives, the more severe must our humiliations be in order to purify us. That was the terrible insight that dawned on me in the cell at Lubyanka as I prayed, shaken and dejected after my experience with the interrogator. So friends, when everything seems to go wrong in your life, when there aren't enough hours in the day or dollars in the wallet, when you pray to God for the outcome of your choosing and instead get something totally different, the chance is very high that we are more like the tax collector and the Pharisee than we think. But with a little humility, we can begin to see what God is actually trying to say.